What if the ship that just handed Iran its most humiliating month of this entire war had been sitting in plain sight for days and almost nobody watching the news noticed it at all? 6 hours of warnings, one missile, and a squad of Marines dropping out of a night sky changed that in an instant, and the ripple effects are still spreading weeks later. Before we get into it, hit like, tap subscribe, and send this to anyone who's been trying to keep up with this war but keeps missing the parts that actually matter, because this particular story says more about where this conflict is really heading than almost anything else that's happened in months of coverage. To understand why one cargo ship could rattle an entire government, you have to go back further than this year, further even than this war. Iran's relationship with sanctioned shipping didn't start in 2026. It started building in earnest years earlier, after nuclear negotiations with Washington collapsed and the United States reimposed sweeping restrictions on Iranian oil exports. Facing a choice between economic strangulation and creative disobedience, Tehran chose the second option. Over the following years, Iran quietly assembled what analysts now casually call a shadow fleet, aging tankers and cargo vessels with murky ownership records, flags of convenience swapped every few months, transponders that mysteriously stop broadcasting the moment a ship enters contested waters. This wasn't a uniquely Iranian invention. Other sanctioned states built similar networks of their own, but Iran had a head start, and by the early part of this decade, its shadow fleet was moving enough discounted crude to keep the country's finances limping along despite years of pressure campaigns from Washington. Ships in that fleet rarely sail directly from Iranian ports to their final buyers. Instead, they loiter, transfer a cargo ship to ship in open water, route through transshipment hubs scattered across Southeast Asia and the Gulf, and reappear later under new names and new registries. None of that on its own was unusual. What made this particular voyage different is what happened next. The current phase of open conflict traces back to mid-April of this year, when peace talks brokered out of Islamabad collapsed entirely. The exact reasons for that collapse remain disputed, with each side blaming the other for walking away from the table, but the practical result was immediate and total. Washington moved from targeted sanctions enforcement to a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. That's a meaningfully different posture. Sanctions enforcement historically meant tracking suspicious vessels, occasionally interdicting a tanker here or there, applying pressure at a distance. A blockade means physically closing the door. American destroyers, operating alongside a full carrier strike group, spread out across the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz with a single standing order. Nothing moves in or out of Iranian waters without American clearance. It's worth sitting with how significant that actually is. The Strait of Hormuz is, by most estimates, the single most important choke point in the global energy trade, with roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and a substantial share of its liquefied natural gas passing through a channel that narrows at its tightest point to barely more than 20 miles wide. And for decades, Iran treated its proximity to that choke point as leverage, occasionally threatening to close the strait entirely whenever tensions with the West spiked. What changed this year is that, for the first time in a long time, the leverage flowed the other direction. It wasn't Iran threatening to close Hormuz. It was the United States effectively controlling who got to use it at all. This isn't Iran's first experience with tanker seizures either, and the earlier history helps explain why officials in Tehran understood the stakes the moment this ship went dead in the water. Years earlier, another Western power seized an Iranian tanker accused of violating sanctions, and within weeks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded by seizing a foreign-flagged tanker of its own in almost direct retaliation. That episode became a template for almost everything that followed. Seize a ship, watch Iran seize a different, often unrelated ship in response, and let the resulting standoff play out through quiet diplomatic back channels rather than open combat. What made this most recent seizure different was scale and visibility. Earlier incidents involved a single vessel, quietly boarded with minimal footage. This one involved a full blockade posture, a filmed helicopter assault, and an American president describing the operation publicly within hours. Iran had seen this particular movie before. It had just never seen this production budget. America's top military officer had laid out the new rules before a single ship was ever touched, making clear that vessels attempting to break the blockade would first receive warnings, and that any ship refusing to comply after that would be boarded by force. That's precisely the sequence that played out with the vessel now widely known as the Touska. Nearly 300 meters long, close in scale to a small aircraft carrier, the ship spent roughly 6 hours trying to push through the blockade near the Gulf of Oman before the destroyer assigned to intercept it disabled its engine room with a single guided strike. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit then fast roped onto the deck from helicopters launched off a nearby amphibious assault ship. This wasn't Iran's first brush with this kind of loss, but it was by a wide margin its most public one. Iran had watched individual vessels get quietly interdicted before, usually with minimal fanfare, the kind of story that shows up in a maritime trade newsletter and nowhere else. This time, Central Command released footage. This time, an American president posted about it personally within hours, describing in blunt, almost casual terms exactly how the ship had been warned, refused, and then disabled. The intended audience wasn't only Tehran, it was every captain still, weighing whether to test the blockade, and every government still watching to see whether Washington's threats carried real weight or were just words on a page. There's a useful comparison worth making here, and it isn't a flattering one for Iran. Years earlier, the United States pursued a similar strategy against another sanctioned oil exporting state, accused of running its own shadow fleet to dodge restrictions. American forces seized tankers linked to that country off its own coast, prompting officials there to cry piracy in almost identical language to what Iranian officials would later use about the Touska. The comparison matters because it reframes what happened here. This wasn't a uniquely Iranian humiliation. It was the latest chapter of a playbook Washington had already run against. More than one sanctioned government, and Iran, whether it liked the comparison or not, had just become the newest member of that particular club. It's also worth remembering that Iran and the United States had already been circling each other over commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz for years before any of this, in a much lower stakes version of the same standoff. Iran's Revolutionary Guard had previously seized foreign-linked container ships near the strait, using almost the exact same tactic later used against the Touska, helicopters descending. Onto a moving deck, special forces securing the bridge, the vessel redirected toward Iranian territorial waters. That earlier pattern matters because it shows this kind of maritime seizure was never a uniquely American invention either. It was a tool both sides had already normalized against each other's shipping long before this particular war escalated into a full blockade. What changed wasn't the tactic itself. It was who now had the overwhelming naval presence needed to use that tactic at scale, night after night, across an entire stretch of contested water, rather than as an occasional isolated incident. Which brings us to the ship itself and to the much harder question underneath it. Why this vessel? Why this cargo? And why did Tehran seem so reluctant to say plainly what was actually on board? Here's the part of this story that tends to get flattened into a single headline when it genuinely deserves a slower explanation. Because the mechanics of how a modern naval blockade identifies, disables, and seizes a specific ship are more interesting than the raw footage suggests. Start with the basic problem American commanders faced. The Strait and the wider Arabian Sea see enormous volumes of legitimate commercial traffic every single day, tankers and container ships from dozens of countries moving oil, grain, electronics, and everything in between. A blockade can't simply stop every ship that approaches. That would strangle global trade far beyond anything aimed specifically at Iran, and it would instantly turn neutral shipping nations into adversaries. So the actual mechanism of enforcement functions more like a filtering system than a wall. Every vessel approaching the strait gets tracked through a combination of satellite surveillance, radar coverage from destroyers on station, and automatic identification system data, the transponder signal most commercial ships are legally required to broadcast. It's less like a locked gate and more like an airport checkpoint that only pulls aside travelers who trip a specific set of flags. Iranian-flagged vessels are an automatic flag. Vessels with ownership records tracing back to sanctioned entities are a flag. Vessels that have gone dark, meaning their transponder mysteriously stopped broadcasting for a stretch of the voyage, a classic shadow fleet tactic, are an enormous flag. Since legitimate commercial shipping has no real reason to disappear from tracking systems mid-voyage, the Touska appears to have tripped several of these simultaneously. Let's dig a little deeper into how investigators actually connected the dots on this specific ship, because the intelligence work behind it is genuinely more sophisticated than a simple radio flag. According to reporting on the operation, American forces had been building a systematic profile of Iran's shadow fleet for months before this vessel ever entered the crosshairs, cross-referencing satellite tracking against known transshipment patterns across multiple regional ports, essentially assembling the kind of patient intelligence picture that makes catching a specific ship look less like luck and more like the product of a deliberate, long-running surveillance campaign. The vessel's recent stop at a known transshipment hub, the kind of port where cargo of uncertain origin can sit long enough for its paper trail to grow murky before continuing on, put investigators on alert well before it ever entered the strait. Analysts examining its ownership structure reportedly found layers of shell companies with commercial links, tracing back across multiple countries. The kind of ownership complexity that legitimate shipping rarely bothers with because legitimate shipping has nothing to hide in the first place. That kind of patient, methodical intelligence work rarely gets the same attention as the dramatic footage of Marines fast roping onto a deck, but it's genuinely the more important half of the story. A single successful interdiction says relatively little on its own. A pattern of successful interdictions, built on months of quiet tracking and cross-referencing, says something much bigger, that the entire shadow fleet system Iran spent years building specifically to survive. Exactly this kind of pressure has a real, exploitable weakness running through it. Every ship caught this way makes the next one slightly easier to catch too, since each seizure adds fresh data about which ports, which shell company structures, and which spoofing techniques are actually being used in practice, rather than just theorized about in intelligence briefings. If you're finding this kind of layered, careful breakdown genuinely helpful for understanding a story, this tangled, drop a comment letting me know which part surprised you most, because a story with this many moving pieces genuinely benefits from readers comparing notes rather than skimming a single headline and moving on. It helps to understand exactly how a ship goes dark, because the term gets thrown around loosely without much explanation. Automatic identification transponders broadcast a vessel's location, speed, and identity continuously, and turning one off mid-voyage is technically simple. A single switch flipped on the bridge. Shadow fleet operators have refined this into something closer to an art form. Transponders get switched off during the least monitored stretches of a voyage. Ship names and registries get quietly reassigned at sea, and some vessels engage in a practice known as identity spoofing, briefly broadcasting the credentials of a completely different legitimate ship to mask their own movements from satellite trackers. None of this is foolproof, and it's exactly the kind of pattern that, once spotted enough times on the same hull, starts building the case file that eventually gets a ship intercepted. Once a vessel is flagged, the next question is what to actually do about it. And this is where the Blockade's rules of engagement genuinely matter. The stated protocol involved a warning phase first, hailing the vessel by radio, demanding it stop for inspection, and giving the crew a window to comply. In the Touska's case, that window stretched to roughly 6 hours, a remarkably long runway by military standards, suggesting American commanders were either genuinely hoping to avoid a confrontation, or were under orders to make the eventual use of force look as clearly justified as possible. Either way, the ship kept moving. When a vessel refuses to stop, commanders face a choice between escalating force and letting it through. And letting it through defeats the entire purpose of a blockade. So the destroyer assigned to intercept the Touska fired specifically at the engine room. Not the hull, not the bridge, the engine room. That's a deliberate targeting decision, and it tells you something important about the operation's actual goal. Sinking the ship would have destroyed whatever cargo and evidence it was carrying, and would have handed Iran a genuine humanitarian and propaganda disaster if crew members had died in the process. Disabling the engine room instead achieved the military objective, stopping the ship while preserving the ability to board it, search it, and use whatever was found as both intelligence and public justification for the entire blockade policy. That's where the second phase kicked in, the part that actually made global headlines, the boarding operation itself. In naval terms, this is what's known as a visit, board, search, and seizure operation, a tactic with a long history in counter-piracy and sanctions enforcement work, though rarely executed at this scale or with this level of public visibility. Marines dropping from helicopters onto a stopped deck sounds dramatic, and it is, but functionally, it's closer to a heavily armed customs inspection than a battlefield assault. The ship had already been rendered immobile. The crew had no meaningful way to resist a fully equipped Marine unit. The actual danger in these operations comes less from the possibility of a firefight, and more from the unpredictability of boarding an unfamiliar vessel in the dark, not knowing what structural damage or panicked crew members might be waiting below deck. Why choose this over quieter alternatives, like continuing to shadow the ship and interdicting it diplomatically once it reached a friendly port? Because the entire point of a blockade is deterrence through visible consequence. A quiet diplomatic interdiction sends no message. To the next captain considering a run at the Strait, a publicly filmed seizure, complete with the president describing the operation in plain language, sends an unmistakable one. It's less a legal maneuver than a demonstration engineered specifically to be watched. The legal justification Washington offered rested on the blockade being tied to enforcement of existing sanctions regimes against Iranian military and weapons-related trade, giving American forces the authority to search and seize vessels reasonably suspected of carrying prohibited cargo. Whether that legal framing would hold up under sustained international scrutiny is a separate question from whether it was actually being enforced. And right now, enforcement was the only variable that mattered to the ships trying to cross that stretch of water. If this kind of grounded, honest storytelling is exactly what keeps you coming back to this channel, tap subscribe, because a war with this many moving parts is easier to follow when someone's actually connecting the pieces for you, instead of dropping isolated headlines. Behind every seized ship and every furious statement out of Tehran, there's a second war happening that most headlines never really capture. A war fought with balance sheets, frozen assets, and carefully worded state media broadcasts. And in some ways, it's the war that will actually decide how this whole thing ends. Start with the raw economics, because they're brutal in a way that's easy to state and hard to fully absorb. The United States has estimated the blockade alone was draining roughly $500 billion a day from an Iranian economy already struggling under years of prior sanctions. Central Command reported intercepting somewhere around 85 vessels attempting to move through Iranian waters since the blockade began, with 3 ships fully seized outright, the Touska among them. Independent maritime tracking data suggests only a small fraction of attempted crossings. Somewhere around 24 actually made it through unimpeded. Multiply that against Iran's near total dependence on oil exports and shipping-linked revenue, and you get a regime bleeding out in a way that doesn't show up in a single dramatic headline, but compounds every single day the blockade holds. Then there's the frozen assets question, which might be the single most aggressive financial move of this entire conflict. And it deserves more attention than it's gotten. Washington has held a substantial pool of Iranian financial assets frozen for years, reportedly somewhere in the range of well over $100 billion, depending on which estimate you use. The American announcement that damages caused by Iranian-backed attacks on commercial shipping would simply be deducted from those frozen funds represented something close to a precedent-setting escalation. Iran's foreign minister publicly warned that normalizing this kind of confiscation, using a state's own frozen assets to cover damages from proxy actions, sets a dangerous global precedent that could unsettle sovereign asset holders far beyond Iran itself. That's a notable admission, because it's an Iranian official essentially conceding that the United States holds financial leverage Iran has no real counter to. Now layer in the propaganda dimension, because this is genuinely interesting from an analytical standpoint. Iranian state media and official statements have consistently framed this war as a conflict forced on Iran by outside powers, rather than a crisis born from Tehran's own strategic choices. That framing isn't accidental or lazy. It's a deliberate domestic messaging strategy, aimed less at convincing the outside world and more at holding together internal political support during a period when the regime's actual military capacity has visibly weakened. When Iranian officials insist, as they have in recent statements, that Iran and not Washington will decide when this war ends, that statement isn't really a threat aimed at the Pentagon. It's a message aimed at Iranian citizens and regional allies, an attempt to project continuity and control at precisely the moment both are in shortest supply. The internal power dynamics matter here too. Iran's military response since losing the Touska has notably not involved direct retaliation against American warships, which would risk immediate and overwhelming escalation Iran cannot currently absorb. Instead, the Revolutionary Guard's naval branch has fallen back on a tactic it's used for over a decade, seizing unrelated commercial vessels near its own coastline as bargaining leverage, a pattern intelligence analysts have tracked through multiple prior standoffs in the Gulf. Within days of losing the Touska, Iran's Revolutionary Guard captured foreign-flagged tankers near its own coast, accusing them of unspecified maritime violations. Iranian officials even floated demanding transit fees from any vessel passing through Hormuz, an attempt to reassert control over the strait through economic coercion, since military coercion was currently off the table. Diplomatically, the picture is just as fractured. Earlier this year, both sides reportedly reached an understanding that would have eased some of these frozen assets in exchange for de-escalation. As of now, neither side appears to be honoring it fully. A prior ceasefire has come and gone, broken repeatedly by strikes from both directions. Regional diplomats have shuttled between Washington and Tehran, trying to build some kind of durable framework for managing shipping traffic through the strait, producing statements and photo opportunities, but nothing that has actually held for long. Iran's public position is notably contradictory on this exact point, too. Officials claim to support renewed talks in one breath, while insisting in the next that Iran has no intention of sitting back down with Washington anytime soon. That contradiction isn't a messaging failure, it's a fairly accurate reflection of where Iran's leadership actually sits right now, exhausted enough and weakened enough militarily to genuinely want the fighting to stop, but too politically boxed in domestically to be the side seen asking for it first. None of that changes what this war is actually costing real people on both sides, and that's worth slowing down for. Behind the ship seizures and the asset freezes and the state media statements, there are people whose lives have been reduced to a single line in a briefing or a state news release, and it's worth being honest about that before moving forward, because both sides in this conflict have suffered in ways that don't reduce cleanly to strategy. Start with the crew of the Touska itself. Iranian officials in an unusually candid admission for a government that rarely explains its own hesitation, indicated their retaliatory response was being deliberately delayed, in part because of concern for those aboard the ship. Whatever the vessel was carrying, whatever its ownership structure obscured, the people physically on that deck when Marines rappelled down were, by all available accounts, working sailors caught in the middle of a geopolitical confrontation they had no hand in creating. The crew's eventual release, arranged through a regional mediator as what officials described as a confidence-building gesture between Washington and Tehran, offered a small, quiet reminder that even amid a full military blockade, both sides still found narrow room for basic humanitarian coordination when it genuinely mattered. That detail rarely made it into the loudest headlines about the seizure itself, but it says something meaningful about how this war actually functions beneath the surface. Even governments locked in open confrontation over a warship's worth of cargo can still find a quiet channel to send exhausted sailors home to their families, which suggests the lines of communication between Washington and Tehran, however strained, have never fully gone dark, even during the tensest weeks of this entire conflict. On the American and Allied side, the human cost has been just as real, if less visible in daily coverage. The Pentagon has confirmed American service members killed in Iranian retaliatory strikes over the course of this war, a toll that has drawn legitimate criticism over how slowly military casualties have sometimes been disclosed. Reports suggest additional troops have suffered injuries described officially as mostly minor, though the true scope of that toll has reportedly been slow to reach the public record. Behind every one of those numbers is a family that found out their loved one was hurt or killed weeks after the fact, through official channels that move far slower than the news cycle around a seized cargo ship. Iranian civilians have absorbed real damage too, with strikes near sensitive infrastructure reportedly triggering air defense activations as explosions shook surrounding areas, and disruptions to hospitals and homes in several provinces that barely register in Western coverage of a naval blockade, but represent a genuine crisis for the people actually living through it. And then there's the slower, quieter cost that doesn't show up in any single dramatic headline, the economic pain radiating outward from a shipping lane that carries a huge share of the world's oil. Drivers thousands of miles away have reportedly paid noticeably more at the pump than before this war began, a direct downstream consequence of instability in the Strait. That's not a headline built for outrage. It's a slow-motion tax on ordinary households far from the Gulf, absorbed quietly every time someone fills a tank of gas. It would be easy, and honestly a little lazy, to reduce this entire situation to a clean story of American strength versus Iranian weakness, or alternatively, to a story of American aggression against a cornered state. Neither framing survives contact with the actual human details. Washington's argument that a nation systematically evading sanctions to fund weapons programs and proxy militias forfeits some claim to unimpeded shipping rights isn't unreasonable on its face. Iran's argument that a foreign navy disabling and boarding its commercial vessels in international waters amounts to an act of war, regardless of what's in the cargo hold, isn't unreasonable either, at least as a matter of principle, even when the regime making that argument has a long record of exactly the sanctions evasion it's now being punished for. There is no version of this conflict where the ordinary sailor or the grieving family back home gets to weigh in on any of it. They simply live with the consequences of decisions made in Washington and Tehran alike. So where does this actually go from here? Based on everything currently on the table, a handful of distinct paths look plausible, and they carry very different levels of risk. The first, and probably the path officials on both sides would publicly claim to prefer, is a genuine diplomatic offo, ramp built around any pause in active strikes, giving negotiators real room to work. But there's a real problem with that path. Both sides have already walked away from at least one negotiated framework this year, and a pause is not the same thing as trust. Nothing in the current diplomatic record suggests either government has developed much of that yet. The second path, and arguably the more likely one given the pattern so far, is continued proxy escalation rather than direct confrontation. Iran has spent much of this conflict avoiding direct strikes on American warships in favor of leaning on regional proxies and its own pattern of seizing unrelated commercial vessels as bargaining chips. Expect more of exactly this. It's a strategy that lets Tehran project strength domestically without inviting the kind of overwhelming retaliation a direct strike on U.S. forces would guarantee. But that path carries its own risk too, since every additional proxy attack risks drawing neighboring states more directly into a conflict Iran can increasingly least afford to widen. A third path is a more direct Iranian attempt to reassert control over the strait itself through measures like transit fees or coordination requirements, effectively trying to claim informal authority over international waters through economic coercion, since military coercion is currently unavailable. This is a genuinely risky move for Tehran to attempt, and it costs Iran almost nothing militarily while forcing Washington to either escalate to stop it or watch the blockade's credibility erode. But any real attempt to functionally close or toll the strait almost certainly triggers an immediate American response, given how explicitly Washington has framed free passage through Hormuz as a red line, and Iran's navy is in no condition, by most outside assessments, to back up that kind of confrontation with force. A fourth and more volatile path involves risks that don't even originate directly from the American blockade at all, but from Iran's own tangled web of alliances elsewhere in the world. Iran's deepening military relationship with other sanctioned powers has, at points during this war, made Iranian assets legitimate targets in conflicts entirely separate from this one, raising the uncomfortable possibility of a second front opening at precisely the moment Iran's military has the least spare capacity in years to fight on even one. That combination, minimal capacity paired with maximum overextension, is exactly the kind of scenario that produces miscalculation. And miscalculation is historically how regional wars become something far larger than anyone originally intended. If I had to rank these paths by what actually seems most likely to unfold over the coming weeks, continued Proxy, pressure remains the most probable default, simply because it's the path Iran has already shown, repeatedly, it's willing to walk. The diplomatic off-ramp remains possible, but genuinely fragile, and it's hard to bet on it holding without a far stronger enforcement mechanism than anything either side has produced so far. The Hormuz coercion attempt and any wider entanglement elsewhere are both lower probability scenarios, but they carry genuinely higher consequences, the kind of moves that could redefine this conflict's scale within days rather than months. If either one actually materializes, that's really the most honest way to understand what happened when Marines dropped onto that deck in the middle of the night. It was never really about that one ship. It was the moment the bluff started to become visible from the outside, the moment it became clear that Tehran's threats and its actual capacity to back them up had drifted a long way apart from each other. Whether that gap eventually forces Iran to the negotiating table on Washington's terms, or whether a cornered government with fewer options left decides its best remaining move is to escalate anyway, is genuinely the open question heading into the months ahead. Watch what happens the next time a ship tries to run a blockade like this one, because how Tehran responds in that moment will tell you more about the real state of this war than any statement coming out of its foreign ministry ever could. A government can keep pushing chips forward across the table for a long time, but eventually everyone sitting at that table can see exactly what's left in its hand, and the choice about what to do with a losing one belongs entirely to the player still holding it, whether that choice comes now or months from now.